So one of the different things that we did to work this unmade and to preserve this unmadeness of the film was we developed a series of what we called seances, and this was also a practical solution of the production side of the film that we didn't want to make. Was instead of producing the film, we thought that we would produce it in a different way. Instead of producing it in a traditionally capitalist format that often we have to submit ourselves to as filmmakers, we thought that we could produce it in a different way by sharing visions rather than asking for money. So we left on a journey, and with the script of Guattari, and we asked people to share their visions, and we thought that instead of filming the film, we would record the sound of people who would share their visions with us. But this is just the book that we published with the script. We would like to read a text that we found in the Guattari archives, where Guattari describes cinema. Maybe you can read it.
I can read it. In every production, in every sequence, in every frame, a choice is made between a conservative economy of desire and a revolutionary breakthrough. The more a film is conceived and produced according to the relations of production or modeled on capitalist enterprise, the more chance there is of participating in the libidinal economy of the system. And in fact, this question of how to, in a sense, permit an unmade film to exist in its unmadeness is particularly pertinent to Guattari's film, which is a science fiction film, and a science fiction film about the advent or the appearance of a form of life, which he calls the infraquark universe, which is, in a sense, an entity smaller than quarks, so really at the limits of invisibility, or even to the point of almost not existing at all. This field of the infraquark universe, which has no form, has no predetermined form at any rate, and can only exist by contaminating the forms which already exist. So the infraquark universe is like this kind of field of contamination that Guattari imagines, and whose form is continually mutating according to the things it comes, or people or elements that it comes into contact with as it is, once it is actually unleashed or once it is revealed in the film. So this question of the visibility or invisibility or materiality or embodiment of the infraquark universe is already posed within the film. And this is something which I think Guattari himself takes to be also a problem of the filmic form itself. Because what we could say is that a paradox of science fiction cinema, or one possible paradox of science fiction cinema, at least a question that we could ask is there really a science fiction cinema, particularly in the sense of exploring new forms of life? Can there be a science fiction cinema if the model of production of cinema, of which science fiction cinema is a part, is a model based on existing relations of production, existing forms of work, existing monetary relations and hierarchies, as the cinema industry is, and it does not exclude science fiction cinema.
In other words, to make a real science fiction film, shouldn't we start by making science fiction forms of production? So another great ally was Pasolini, of course, and his text, un film I'm forgetting all languages, but un film...
The screenplay as a structure...
come una struttura che vuole essere un'altra struttura.
The screenplay as a structure that wants to be another structure.
Yes, which is in empirismo eretico. And in particular, here we put just an image of one of the sciences, in particular this was in Casco. The author of a screenplay asked his addressee for a particular collaboration, namely that of lending to the text a visual completeness which it does not have, but at which it hints. The reader is an accomplice immediately, and his representational imagination enters into a creative phase much higher and more intense than when he reads a novel.
So this question of the screenplay as this potentially mutating entity, a structure that wants to be another structure, also in a sense opens up the question of whether a screenplay would necessarily want to become a film under the existing conditions of production that pertain. So if we consider the screenplay, a Guattari's screenplay, as a form of life or as a potential form of life, would that, without a form, as the infraquark universe is, would that form of life essentially necessarily want to become a film as we understand it, as a form, as a particular set of structures? And so the seance was a way, in a sense, of maintaining this field of indeterminacy of the form of the infraquark universe and of Guattari's film itself open, and open in a way which linked to what Guattari was saying in the previous citation about the actual question of the political nature of making films. And for us, the seance was a way of posing this question of the film with what we could call a temporary community, or what we might also call a community without community. In any case, a group of people who gathered. We basically just announced that we were doing this, and anybody who wanted to could come, to gather around the screenplay and try to share their visions of what the film seemed to the film that was coming into being for them on the basis of this screenplay, which functioned as a contaminant, as a contaminating virus in the same way that the infraquark universe does in the film. So at this point, the question becomes, first of all, that the community who are gathered around the screenplay are faced with these decisions about what kind of film they want to make, in a way which redoubles the question of what kind of community they are producing as they are thinking about the film. Because when Guattari says a political decision is made in every sequence, in every shot, in every decision that you make, in terms of constructing visions that appear or that are solicited by the screenplay, those kind of political questions become, in a sense, the questions that we need to discuss. We need to discuss things like how a character is presented or represented, what a camera is doing. And those questions are not just any more cinematic questions, they're questions about the actual possible, let's say, constructive nature of communities themselves and the kind of political decisions they take.
Yeah, so what we did after the sciences, we actually made sound work, or now it's become an invisible film that we're screening tonight, so you're very welcome to come. And when we were working on the sound mix with the sound engineer, we actually realized that it was taking the form probably, or some possible forms of Guattari's film, or a kind of some molecules, dispersed molecules of Guattari's film through the collectivity. There are about 85 voices that participate in this invisible film. But at the same time, it became like the portrait of these dispersed communities that took part. So the interesting thing is that the way when we make a fiction film, it's always a documentary, and it's documentary of its making, of its production, of the money, of the failure of the film. So it became actually a portrait of the people that participated more than anything else.
And particularly of the question of the dispersed, the community which could only exist through this recomposition of the seances themselves. So what in our invisible film or our sound work, we basically allow these communities to converse with each other in a way in which they form a kind of virtual community, and a community which in a sense mirrors one of the crucial aspects of Guattari's script, which is that the infraquark universe appears to a community of people who are on the margins of society, who live in a squat, who are of different generations, who have different forms of marginality to the normative patterns of the society in which they live. So that is the first of the devices, the device that we had been developing in the last 2 years, up until I think about 2015, when we made that work, Week the Unmaking of. And that corresponds to one of 3 axes of what we would call dark matter cinema, which is this question of cinema as what is invisible in cinema, or the potential space of cinema, or the invisible as a potential space in cinema. And one of those axes of the seance is the unmade film as a potential space for the kind of construction through visions. Importantly, through visions and not through knowledge, because one of the things that we discovered in this process was that sharing visions enabled the community to come together in a way in which knowledge would not, precisely because it avoids one of the big problems of communities based on knowledge sharing, which is the power which in a sense traverses the sharing of knowledge. Those who have knowledge, those who don't, those who are looking to seeking to get knowledge, the conditions in which knowledge becomes available, and the conditions in which knowledge is transmitted. Visions retains this kind of indeterminacy, both of the question of who, a vision is not a piece of knowledge, for example. A vision is something which is a fragile entity in becoming, and which in a sense requires another kind of economy, or libidinal economy of the community, an economy of trust and of support for these kind of fragile articulations, which are also stammerings as well. So that would be the unmade. A second, and in a sense which is between the unmade and the third, would be the black screen, or the interval, or the interstice. Forms of cinema, for example, such as we could cite Guy Debord's Ullman en faveur de Sade, or Jorge César Montero's Branca de Neve, or certain films of Marguerite Duras, notably L'Homme Atlantique, where the black screen functions as a kind of indeterminate interval of something that needs to be constructed, of an image that cannot be made present, and therefore becomes the project of a community or a future community to produce these images which are not present. It's also the interstice of montage, and what classical montage tries to make us forget, which is precisely the space between images. So that would be the bridge with the third component, which we would call the infra-image. And the infra-image would be, in a sense, the invisibility in the visible image, the part of the visible image which remains invisible, or which can only become visible under certain conditions. And this leads us to the second device that we constructed for this kind of collective sharing of images or visions, and what we are actually experimenting here at the Jornadas during our workshops. And this is the dark matter cinema tarot. You want to? So the question of the dark matter cinema tarot was, we became interested in the tarot when we were working on Guattari's script, because we actually asked the tarot reader to read the future of the film. And the tarot reader had great difficulty in answering this request, because they said, the tarot reader said, the reading has to be about you, the person who asks. It cannot be about something which is separate from you as a subject, as an individual. The tarot reading has to be based on the actual subjectivity of the querent, the person who asks. And this struck us as a certain limitation, a political limitation of tarot, that why should the tarot be about simply the individual? And then we started looking at tarot practices, and we saw how tarot practices are now increasingly integrated into certain economies of individual expectations and the arc of kind of life chances in terms of job, in terms of finding a partner and so on, but are in a sense integrated into what we could call on the one hand a classical story arc of Hollywood cinema, of a situation, obstacles that prevent the realization of an objective, the way to overcome those obstacles, which is a very classical form of cinema. So we were thinking about the tarot as how could we reinvent the tarot in such a way that it, in a sense, we could sidestep, or we could critique, or we could rethink those limitations, or these ideological limitations that we saw that the tarot had adopted in modern society. So we invented what we called the dark matter cinema tarot. And there were two aspects to this. One was we thought we want to get rid of the symbolic structure of the tarot. We wanted to get rid of the elements, for example, the major and minor arcana, and the definite symbolic values which are attributed to cards. That was one of the first things we wanted to do. And then secondly, we wanted to see if we could use cinema to do tarot, if the cinema in a sense functioned as a kind of modern unconscious of archetypes or of proto-archetypes in all of its volatility, in all of its indeterminacy, in such a way that we could in some sense create a modern tarot based on what this repository of as yet unnamed and perhaps unnameable symbols that cinema in its, as we saw, for example, in the images that Kojo showed of the end of the film, in this radical ambiguity that cinema preserves. And so we created a tarot pack based on photograms, cinema photograms. And we started doing readings. But the other question, which we talked about at the beginning, was the individual thing, which was the question of that the querent would no longer be simply somebody asking for themselves. They would be somebody asking a question that concerned a wider group of people, a wider community, and that the reader would no longer be an individual reader, but would be the community itself, of which the querent then became a part. Yeah, going to go forward. So here, for example, we have a reading from yesterday. Or was it no, the day before yesterday.
The first day.
This was, the question here was, how was it possible that the election results in Spain were the way they were? What actually happened? And this was the reading that, these were the cards which came up.
And we spoke about 1 hour and a half?
Yeah, we had a discussion for about an hour and a half. But we're not going to go into that now. I'm not going to even summarize it. Yeah. But just to say that we can maybe move to the next image. That the actual structure, I want to maybe just say a couple of things about how how the tarot functions.
We said we were speaking 15 minutes.
Yeah, I know.
I think
it's already I don't know. It's already
long.
okay. The querent.
I can't wait to move to the next phase.
Yeah, we can.
So just 2 minutes, girl.
The principle here is what we could call is in some sense what we could call a refractive principle, in the sense that the querent's question, instead of asking this question directly, as we would in a political meeting, we ask the question to the cards. So the cards function as this kind of refractive prism of the question, which is then kind of spectralizes according to the images which are produced and according to the particular effects of montage and between the images and the spaces, the gaps, the black spaces between the images, which are then further, if you like, spectralized by the singularities of the community and their particular angle of approach to those images. So in this way, the image, in a sense, becomes something which finally becomes an infra-image, an image which can never be determined except in these unlocatable singularities of its instantiation, of its actual appearance, and its repeated appearance depending on the particular angle that the question, that the querent, and that the community of readers actually give to, and of course the montage, that give to each individual image.
I just wanted to say that yesterday we had a brilliant question, because I don't know if no, he's not here, that worried us a lot, because the questions are posed to the cards, and they are answered describing the cards, so already it's a dispositif that is very self-reflexive. The question was posed to the cards and was almost about the cards. So the person asked whether it's possible to share and a dispositif, I don't know how to say it, of a device of non-knowledge, and whether it works and how. Is this the question? Magic and non-knowledge of alternative knowledge and non-hegemonic. So it was almost describing what we are trying to do with these things, but it was asked to the cards, and then also, and then I asked to repeat it in Spanish, because the person who asked was Colombian, and I wanted really to hear it, and then he added that he was reading Silvia Federici's book, so, you know, we really understood that he expected something from the cards à la hauteur de la question, and the cards were really giving, they were immediately reacted and gave him a counter mirror of the mirror of the trap that he was posing to the card. I don't know, there are people here that were there yesterday, I don't know what you think, but the cards were behaving quite well, no? They were quite up to the task of the question.
We could simply say that the very last card, which is the synthesis of the reading, what came up was the image of somebody approaching a mirror and somebody trying to prevent them from approaching the mirror, as if to say it's dangerous to ask mirroring questions to the tarot.
Well, that's Graeme's cynical.
One possible.
Something I would like to share was, for example, the first card was really amazing because it was a schoolgirl wearing a school uniform, and then there was a force that was capturing her that looked like a kind of tale of something that was the hors-champ. And it's really interesting. Jodorowsky speaks a lot about how also in the Marseille tarots, the hors-champ is very, very important, like in cinema, because you don't see it, but then when you start looking at the cards, you can fabulate around what is outside. And then when you are in a group, you can really start constructing narratives between the people of this outside. So the girl is taken by this force, and you just see like this, and is probably, we were talking together whether she's resisting, but then we saw that she was actually quite confident being taken by this force, and she's wearing a school uniform. So this, for example, is the first card that came in this tirage, but today we're going to do another 3 hours. Okay. So Graeme is going to shut me up.
So just another little scientific schema for your enjoyment. This is just another, what we could call the second refractive prism, which is what pertains in a sense to the cards themselves. The cards which are the images which are refracted precisely by the question, that the question in a sense deterritorializes the images, the cinema images that in a sense belong to a particular narrative chain, belong to a particular form of the film. They are in a sense somehow entrapped in the teleology or the fatality of the film, but the question releases them from this fatality. It opens them to other possible destinies and other possible montages as well. Okay?
Yeah.
So, right. Is that...
Okay, now we would pass to...
Now we're passing from the theoretical part to the second part of our presentation, where we're going to stop speaking, because I think we've spoken enough. And instead we're actually going to let cinema speak in our place. You ready? Okay, I'm just a minute.
tenemos presidencia y igual después, ¿no? Podemos continuar o en otro momento, vamos a mañana.
Sí.
We are here
Tonight there's the... I don't know if we mentioned it, Silvia?
Sí, esta noche a las 9:30 en Teatro Pradillo tenemos
The unmaking of. So this is it's the sound work that we were talking about in relation to the seances, kind of electroacoustic, spatialized sound work, which has now subtitles. We made subtitles in Spanish and in French. So we're showing it with Spanish subtitles. So therefore it becomes an invisible film because it has a screen. So it's an invisible film.